his children become gods, heroes, and monsters. The stories seem to fit together, generation by generation, as if someone designed the whole system in advance. But no ancient Greek ever possessed a single definitive mythology book. There was no official canon, no master list of gods, no final version that every city, poet, and worshipper agreed to follow. So who connected the stories? The answer is not one author. It is a constellation of traditions, gradually linked by ritual, poetry, art, and memory. Some stars were bright almost everywhere. Others belonged to a single region, a single sanctuary, or a single poet. Later storytellers drew connections between them, and audiences learned to recognize a shared world. One of the most influential attempts to organize that constellation came from a poet named Hesiod. But Hesiod was not reporting the one true beginning of Greek mythology. He was giving one powerful arrangement of material that already existed in many forms. To understand what he arranged, we have to begin before the gods had names. In Hesiod's theogony, the first presence is chaos. That word can mislead modern readers. Chaos does not initially mean a mess or random disorder, or a universe where nothing follows any pattern. In this poem, chaos is closer to a primordial chasm, a gap or void that exists before the ordered world takes shape. Then comes Gaia, the earth. Gaia is not simply a planet floating through space. She is the living ground itself, a foundational power with a body, a will, and a place in the emerging divine family. Alongside her appear other primordial beings, including Tartarus, the deep region below the world, and Eros, the force of attraction that makes generation possible. Night and darkness also emerge, bringing with them a long line of powers associated with sleep, death, dreams, and fate. The first revelation is easy to miss, because later retellings often simplify it. The Greek universe does not begin with a battle between order and disorder. It begins with a chasm, then with the appearance of powers that allow relationships, birth, and structure to develop. The cosmos is not instantly complete. It is a constellation coming into focus. Gaia gives birth to Uranus, the sky, and to the mountains and the sea. Uranus then joins with Gaia, and together they produce the Titans, a generation of enormous divine beings who represent some of the world's earliest powers. Among them are Oceanus, the river that encircles the world in ancient imagination; Hyperion, associated with heavenly light; Mnemosyne, memory; Themis, divine order; and Rhea, who will become the mother of the Olympian gods. There are also darker figures in this generation. The Cyclopes possess extraordinary strength and craft. The 100-handers, or Hecatoncheires, are beings of immense power with 100 hands each. These creatures are not merely monsters waiting for heroes to defeat them. At this stage of the story, they are part of the family of the cosmos. The categories have not settled yet. God, ancestor, force of nature, and dangerous creature all occupy neighboring points in the same constellation. But Uranus fears his children. He forces the Cyclopes and the 100-handers back into the depths of Gaia. The exact imagery varies across traditions, but the pattern is consistent in Hesiod's account. The first ruling power tries to prevent the next generation from appearing. Gaia suffers under the pressure. She forms a great sickle and asks her children to act. Only Cronus, the youngest Titan, agrees. When Uranus returns to Gaia, Cronus attacks him and takes control of the cosmos. From the blood that falls onto the earth come further beings, including the Erinyes, or Furies, and the Giants. In another famous episode, Uranus's severed body falls into the sea, and Aphrodite emerges from the foam. Even here, the details are not fixed across all Greek traditions. Aphrodite has other genealogies. In Homeric poetry, she is more closely connected to Zeus and Dione. The version most familiar today is one powerful node in the constellation, not a universal agreement. Cronus has overthrown the sky, but the story has not escaped its pattern. A ruler has feared his children, and a child has replaced him. The next generation is already waiting. Cronus marries his sister Rhea, and together they have Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon. But Cronus has heard a prophecy. One of his own children will overthrow him. So each time Rhea gives birth, Cronus swallows the child. The image is strange because it is meant to be. Greek myth does not always separate cosmic scale from physical horror. A god can be a force governing the world, and also a parent committing an act of desperate violence. Rhea cannot accept the loss of her children. When Zeus is born, she hides him in Crete and gives Cronus a stone wrapped in swaddling clothes. Cronus swallows the stone, believing he has secured his rule. The infant Zeus grows in secret. Later stories place him among the mountain caves of Crete, protected by nymphs and guarded by the Curetes, whose clashing weapons drown out his cries. These Cretan details belong to a regional tradition that became attached to the larger story. They remind us that myths were not born in one room. A local sacred story could become connected to a wider divine genealogy. When Zeus is grown, he returns to confront Cronus. With the help of Metis, a figure associated with intelligence and cunning, Zeus gives Cronus a substance that makes him disgorge the children he swallowed. The stone comes out first. Then Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon emerge, alive and ready to join the struggle. Now the conflict expands from a family crisis into a war for the universe. The Titans stand with Cronus. Zeus leads the younger gods. The fighting lasts 10 years. The details are sparse in the surviving early poems, but the consequence is enormous. Zeus releases the Cyclopes and the Hundred-Handers from their imprisonment, and their power changes the balance of the war. The Cyclopes forge Zeus's thunderbolt, Poseidon's trident, and Hades' helmet of invisibility. The Hundred-Handers hurl stones with their many hands. The younger generation wins. The Titans are defeated and confined to Tartarus, though not every Titan shares the same fate. Some, such as Oceanus, remain outside the central conflict. Atlas, often associated with the defeated generation, is punished by being made to hold up the sky. Again, later poets and artists adjust the constellation. Atlas's punishment becomes one of the most recognizable images in Greek mythology, even though its place in the larger story shifts across traditions. With the Titanomachy, Zeus becomes the leading power. But the world is not finished. The Olympians have won a throne. They still need to determine what the throne means. Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades draw lots to divide the cosmos. Zeus receives the sky. Poseidon receives the sea. Hades rules the underworld. The earth itself remains a shared space, even if different gods claim different territories and privileges. This division is not the creation of a peaceful family. The Olympians argue, deceive one another, fall in love, compete for cities, and interfere in the lives of mortals. Their order is political in the broadest sense. It is a distribution of power among beings who do not always agree about how that power should be used. Zeus becomes the center of the Olympian constellation, but he is not an all-powerful creator in the later monotheistic sense. He inherited a world shaped by older forces, and even Zeus must contend with fate, prophecy, and the limits built into divine genealogy. Hera, his sister and wife, governs marriage and queenship. The stories about their relationship are full of conflict, especially because Zeus's many affairs produce a long list of divine and heroic children. These myths reflect the logic of power more than any ideal domestic life. Hera protects marriage, while also becoming one of the most persistent opponents of Zeus's lovers and children. Poseidon controls the sea, earthquakes, and horses. Sailors appeal to him because the sea is never merely a setting. It is a divine power that can carry a ship home or erase it without warning. Hades rules the dead. He is not simply the Greek equivalent of a devil. The underworld is not identical to a place of punishment. It is the realm of the dead, governed by a stern god whose authority is necessary for the world to remain divided between life and death. Demeter governs grain, cultivation, and the seasonal rhythms that sustain human life. Her daughter, Persephone, becomes central to one of the most important myths about the underworld. According to the best-known version, Hades takes Persephone to his realm. Demeter searches for her, and in her grief she withholds the fertility of the earth. Crops fail. Human beings face starvation. Zeus intervenes, but Persephone has eaten pomegranate seeds in the underworld. Because of that act, she must spend part of the year with Hades and part with her mother. The story offers an explanation for seasonal change, but it also carries the emotional force of a mother confronting loss. Its meaning cannot be reduced to a weather pattern. The myth was connected to religious rituals at Eleusis, where initiates entered a sacred tradition promising knowledge or hope in relation to death. The details of those rites remain partly hidden, as the participants intended. Athena is born from Zeus's head after he swallows Metis, fearing a prophecy about her future child. She becomes the goddess of strategy, wisdom, and civic protection. Athens claims her as its patron after a contest with Poseidon. Poseidon offers a saltwater spring, while Athena gives the city the olive tree. The story presents the city as choosing the form of power it wants to represent, though other regions honored Poseidon and Athena in different ways. Apollo governs prophecy, music, healing, and archery. Artemis governs the wilderness, hunting, and childbirth. Ares embodies the violence of war, while Hephaestus represents fire, metalwork, and craft. Aphrodite governs desire and attraction. Hermes carries messages between divine and mortal worlds, protects travelers, and moves easily across boundaries. Dionysus, sometimes counted among the Olympians and sometimes treated as a later arrival, brings wine, theatre, ecstasy, and the unsettling loss of ordinary control. There is no single fixed list of 12 gods that every Greek community used in exactly the same way. Hestia can occupy a place that later lists give to Dionysus. Local gods and older powers remain important, even when the Olympians dominate the poems most familiar to modern readers. The Olympian order is therefore not a closed diagram. It is a central cluster with older stars around it, regional stars beside it, and new connections forming over time. The gods now control the great divisions of the cosmos. But where do human beings fit? One answer begins with Prometheus. Prometheus is a titan, yet he sides with Zeus during the war against Cronus. Later stories make him humanity's advocate, trickster, and teacher. He is often described as shaping humans from clay, though that detail belongs to later developments of the tradition, rather than one uniform original account. In Hesiod, Prometheus challenges Zeus over the division of an animal sacrifice. He hides the edible meat inside the animal's stomach, and presents the bones covered in fat, making the less useful portion look more desirable. Zeus sees through the trick and chooses punishment. Fire is withheld from humanity. Prometheus steals it back. For this, Zeus chains him to a mountain, where an eagle eats his liver each day. Because Prometheus is immortal, the liver grows back, and the punishment begins again. The story explains why humans possess fire, but it also asks what civilization costs. Fire means cooking, metalwork, warmth, and technology. It also means distance from the natural world, and a new kind of responsibility. Zeus answers the theft with another punishment. He sends Pandora, the first woman in Hesiod's account, carrying a sealed jar. When the jar is opened, suffering and hardship spread among humanity. Hope remains inside, depending on how the passage is interpreted. This version is one of the most influential, but it is not the only ancient account of human origins. Greek poets describe multiple human ages, including an age of gold, followed by silver, bronze, and iron. Some stories imagine humans emerging from the earth. Others connect particular peoples to a divine ancestor or a local hero. The contradictions are not mistakes waiting for us to correct. They are evidence. Greek mythology grew from many sources, and those sources did not always agree. A city had its own rituals. A sanctuary had its own sacred history. A poet inherited older material and reshaped it for a new audience. An artist placed a familiar figure in a new scene. A later culture connected two traditions that had once stood apart. The constellation expanded by addition, not by replacing every earlier star. The gods are immortal, but Greek myths become most human when they turn toward heroes. Heroes occupy a difficult point in the constellation. They are often born from a god and a mortal, or descended from a divine family, but forced to live under human limits. They can achieve extraordinary things, but they cannot simply become gods by winning. Perseus is one of the earliest famous examples. His grandfather hears a prophecy that a child born to his daughter Danae will kill him. He locks Danae away, but Zeus reaches her in the form of golden light or rain, depending on the telling. Perseus is born, and the prophecy sets the story in motion. Danae and Perseus are cast out to sea in a chest, and eventually rescued. As a young man, Perseus is ordered to retrieve the head of Medusa, one of the Gorgons. Medusa's gaze turns anyone who looks directly at her to stone. Perseus does not defeat her through strength alone. Athena gives him a polished shield, and he uses its reflection to approach without meeting Medusa's eyes. Hermes provides further assistance in some versions. Perseus cuts off her head and uses it as a weapon before giving it to Athena, who places it on her shield. On his journey home, Perseus rescues Andromeda, who has been chained to a rock as an offering to a sea monster. He marries her and returns to confront the king who sent him away. But the prophecy still waits. In a contest, Perseus accidentally kills his grandfather with a discus. The attempt to escape fate has fulfilled it. Heracles, known to the Romans as Hercules, becomes the most famous Greek hero. He possesses immense strength, but the stories are not simple celebrations of power. Heracles is driven into a violent act during a period of madness sent by Hera. To atone, he is ordered to perform a series of labours. The number is traditionally 12, though the story develops over time. He kills the Nemean lion, defeats the Hydra, captures the Erymanthian boar, cleans the stables of Augeas, seizes the golden apples of the Hesperides, and brings Cerberus out of the underworld. Each labour connects Heracles to a different point in the mythic world. He enters wilderness, foreign lands, divine gardens, and the realm of the dead. He defeats monsters, but his deeper struggle is with guilt, rage, and the limits of human endurance. Theseus is associated with Athens and the labyrinth of Crete. The Minotaur, part human and part bull, is kept inside a maze built by Daedalus. Theseus enters, uses Ariadne's thread to find his way back, and kills the creature. The story links Athens to Crete through violence, tribute, and escape. It also shows how a local hero can become part of the wider constellation. Theseus belongs especially to Athenian identity, but his adventures are retold as part of the shared Greek world. Jason's quest for the Golden Fleece brings together another group of heroes, the Argonauts. Among them are Heracles, Orpheus, Castor and Polydeuces, and other figures whose stories will continue elsewhere. Jason succeeds because Medea, a sorceress and daughter of the king who guards the fleece, helps him. She provides the knowledge and magic he needs, then leaves her home with him. Their relationship later becomes one of the darkest stories in Greek tragedy. Bellerophon captures the winged horse Pegasus and defeats the Chimera, a creature combining lion, goat, and serpent. But after his victories, he attempts to rise to Olympus. Zeus sends an insect to unsettle Pegasus, and Bellerophon falls. He survives, but wanders alone, separated from ordinary human life. The message is familiar across Greek myth. Excellence can bring honor, but the desire to cross every boundary can destroy the person who succeeds. Orpheus enters the underworld to retrieve Eurydice. His music moves the dead and persuades Hades to release her on one condition. Orpheus must walk ahead and not look back until they reach the world above. He turns too soon. The story survives because the failure is so small. No monster defeats him. No god strikes him down. One moment of doubt breaks the connection between the living and the dead. Greek monsters are not all alike. Some are opponents in heroic tests. Others mark the borders of the human world. Many represent older powers that the newer divine order has not entirely absorbed. The Hydra grows multiple heads when one is cut off. The Nemean lion cannot be pierced by ordinary weapons. The Sphinx asks a riddle before allowing travellers to pass. Scylla and Charybdis threaten sailors crossing narrow waters. The Sirens use music to draw ships toward destruction. The Minotaur, Medusa, and the Chimera each combine forms that do not belong together in ordinary life. Their bodies make visible the instability at the edges of the human world. Yet, Greek myth does not always treat monsters as purely evil. Medusa, in some traditions, begins as a beautiful woman transformed into a gorgon. The centaurs include violent creatures such as Nessus, but also the wise teacher Chiron. The serpent Python guards Delphi before Apollo defeats it and takes control of the sanctuary. That final example matters. When one god defeats another creature and claims its sanctuary, the story can preserve a memory of religious change. A newer cult does not erase the older power completely. It connects itself to that power through victory. This is one way the constellation of Greek religion developed. Old sacred places acquired new stories. Local beings were placed into genealogies with more widely known gods. A hero from one region travelled into the stories of another. The connections were never neutral. They reflected competition, migration, political influence, and the authority of sanctuaries. The most famous cluster of Greek heroic stories gathers around Troy. The conflict begins with a divine dispute. At a wedding, the goddess Eris sends a golden apple marked for the fairest. Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite each claim it. Zeus refuses to judge between them and assigns the decision to Paris, a prince of Troy. Each goddess offers him a reward. Hera promises power. Athena promises victory and wisdom. Aphrodite promises the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris chooses Aphrodite. That woman is Helen, already married to Menelaus, king of Sparta. Paris takes her to Troy, or in some versions, persuades her to leave with him. Menelaus calls upon the other Greek kings, many of whom had once competed to marry Helen and sworn to defend the chosen match. The Greek expedition sails for Troy. The war lasts 10 years. The walls of Troy hold. The poems that survive do not tell the entire war from beginning to end. Homer's Iliad focuses on a short period near the conflict's conclusion, especially the anger of Achilles. Achilles is the greatest warrior among the Greeks, but he has been dishonoured by Agamemnon, the expedition's commander. Achilles withdraws from battle, and the Trojans begin to gain ground. The gods take sides. Hera and Athena support the Greeks. Apollo, Aphrodite, and others assist Troy. Their interventions make the war a conflict between divine interests as well as human armies. Achilles eventually returns after his companion Patroclus is killed by Hector, Troy's greatest defender. Achilles kills Hector and drags his body behind his chariot. Later, he allows Hector's father, King Priam, to reclaim the body. That meeting is one of the most intimate scenes in ancient epic. Priam enters the tent of the man who killed his son and asks him to remember his own father. Achilles sees the shared grief between them. For a moment, the constellation of enemies becomes a constellation of mourners. Achilles later dies, traditionally from an arrow to his vulnerable heel. The Greeks finally take Troy through the wooden horse, a plan associated with Odysseus. Warriors hide inside the structure, the Trojans bring it within their walls, and the Greek army returns under cover of night. Troy falls. But the story does not end with victory. The Greek commanders return through storms, shipwrecks, murder, and betrayal. Agamemnon is killed by his wife Clytemnestra, or by her lover Aegisthus, depending on the focus of the tradition. Odysseus spends 10 years trying to reach Ithaca, encountering the Cyclops, Circe, the Sirens, Scylla, Charybdis, and the anger of Poseidon. The Trojan constellation keeps expanding because each major character generates a new route through the story. Helen's life becomes a question about blame and appearance. Clytemnestra's story becomes a tragedy about revenge. Odysseus' journey becomes a study of endurance and homecoming. A war that begins with a divine beauty contest opens into a vast network of poems about memory, violence, loyalty, and loss. Even here, no single ancient text contains everything. Epic poems, tragedies, local legends, and later Roman retellings preserve different sections and emphases. The famous wooden horse is not central to the surviving Iliad. The full sequence of Achilles' death, the fall of Troy, and the returns of the Greek kings comes from a wider cycle of traditions, many of which survive only in fragments or later summaries. What we call the Trojan War is therefore a name for a constellation, not one finished narrative. By this point, the pattern should be visible. The stories were not first created as chapters in a single mythology. They became connected through repeated acts of transmission. Poets carried stories from place to place. Performers adapted them for new audiences. Sanctuaries linked local gods to wider divine families. Artists repeated recognizable scenes on pottery, sculpture, and temple decoration. Religious festivals gave certain myths a public life, while mystery rituals kept other meanings restricted to initiates. Homer and Hesiod were especially influential because later Greeks treated their poems as major sources for understanding the gods. But they were not the only voices, and their poems did not agree on every genealogy, motive, or event. Homer's gods are deeply involved in heroic action. Hesiod is more interested in divine origins, labour, justice, and the structure of generations. Later poets add stories, alter relationships, and bring different local traditions into contact. A god's identity could change with the place where that god was worshipped. Artemis in one region might be associated with wilderness and hunting. In another, she might absorb the features of an older local goddess. Dionysus could appear as a god of wine, a god of theatre, a god of ecstatic ritual, or a stranger arriving from outside the community. The Greeks did not experience these differences as a failure of the system. The system was flexible because religion was local. A person could honour the gods of the wider Greek world while also serving a deity whose importance was concentrated in one town or sanctuary. That is the second revelation. The contradictions are not evidence that Greek mythology was badly assembled. They are evidence that it was assembled at all. Different communities preserved different stars. Poets drew different lines between them. Later audiences saw a constellation where earlier generations may have seen several separate clusters. This also explains why modern summaries can feel more orderly than the ancient material. Modern retellings often place creation, titans, Olympians, heroes, and Trojan War in a single sequence. That sequence is useful, and it reflects influential ancient arrangements, especially Hesiod's genealogy. But it is a reconstruction. There was never one ancient Greek version that settled every question. The stories continued to change when Greek culture entered the Roman world. Roman writers adopted Greek gods and connected them to Roman deities. Zeus became Jupiter. Hera became Juno. Aphrodite became Venus. Ares became Mars. Hermes became Mercury. But these were not simple translations. Roman religion had its own traditions, priorities, and political uses. Venus, for example, became central to Roman identity through the story of Aeneas, the Trojan hero who escaped the destruction of his city and became an ancestor of the Roman people. Virgil's Aeneid connects the fall of Troy to the foundation of Rome, giving the Roman world a place within the older Greek constellation. The emphasis changes. Greek myth often returns to the fragile relationship between gods, heroes, and the limits of human life. Roman writers also use these stories to think about empire, duty, ancestry, and political destiny. Ovid's Metamorphoses gathers hundreds of myths into a flowing sequence of transformations. Gods become animals, plants, stars, stones, and rivers. Old stories are placed beside one another in new relationships. Ovid preserves traditions while also playing with them, questioning their violence and exposing the instability of divine power. The Roman versions became enormously influential in Europe. Medieval and Renaissance writers encountered Greek myth through Latin texts, often without direct access to the earliest Greek sources. Painters, poets, dramatists, and scholars then reorganized the material again. The constellation kept changing names and positions. In the modern world, Greek mythology appears in novels, films, games, advertisements, classrooms, and political language. A story can be stripped from its ritual setting and still remain recognizable. Medusa becomes an image of resistance. Icarus becomes a warning about ambition, although the earliest versions of that story are more complicated than the slogan suggests. Narcissus becomes a symbol of self-absorption. Prometheus becomes an image of scientific rebellion. These uses do not preserve the myths unchanged. They create new connections. A modern adaptation may give a minor figure a central role. It may combine versions that were separated in antiquity. It may turn a tragic character into a hero, or a monster into a victim, or a god into a metaphor for a human problem. That is not a betrayal of some fixed original. It is how the tradition has always worked. So, who connected Greek mythology? Not Homer alone, not Hesiod alone, not the priests of one sanctuary or the artists of one city, or the Romans who later gave the gods new names. The connections were made by generations. Hesiod's theogony gives us one of the clearest surviving arrangements. It begins with chaos as a primordial chasm, moves through Gaia and Uranus, follows the Titans, and arrives at Zeus and the Olympians. It provides a genealogy that later readers could use as a central set of coordinates. But it is one influential synthesis among many. Homer connects gods to heroes through the pressures of war and homecoming. Tragedians connect divine stories to civic questions and family violence. Local cults connect major gods to particular landscapes. Rituals connect myth to lived religious practice. Roman poets connect Greek gods to imperial ancestry and transformation. Modern storytellers connect ancient figures to new ideas about identity, power, trauma, freedom, and justice. Each generation inherits the constellation and rearranges its lines. Some connections fade, others become permanent. A local story can be absorbed into a famous genealogy. A minor figure can become a cultural symbol. A version once known only in one region can become the version taught around the world. The result is a mythology that feels unified without ever having been uniform. That distinction matters. When we treat Greek mythology as a fixed canon, contradictions look like errors. When we see it as an evolving network of traditions, the contradictions become clues. They point toward the communities, poets, rituals, and political worlds that kept the stories alive. Return to the opening image. Zeus on Olympus, Poseidon beneath the waves, Hades among the dead, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Aphrodite, Dionysus, Perseus facing Medusa, Heracles entering the underworld, Achilles before the walls of Troy. Together, they look like a finished universe. But the apparent unity is the result of centuries of connection. It was made by people who inherited stories and refused to leave them isolated. They placed a local god beside a famous one. They gave a hero a divine ancestor. They linked a ritual to a season, a city to a goddess, a fallen warrior to a returning king. The Greek myths endure because later cultures keep doing the same thing. They do not simply preserve the constellation, they look at it from a new position and find a different shape. The first word in Hesiod's creation story is often translated as chaos, but its older sense points to an opening, a chasm, a space from which relationships can emerge. That is a fitting beginning for the tradition itself. Greek mythology begins in a gap, and it remains alive because that gap is never completely closed. There is no final book that contains every god, every genealogy, every regional variation, or every ending. There is only the constellation, enlarged by each telling. And the question is no longer just who connected it. The question is what new connection will be made next. If you want to follow more of those connections, subscribe for the next story.